But I think I want to start by focusing on your role in the rearing of Yvonne. I I think in my own family, there were many ways in which grandfather was not a good father to his first round of children, and I know that his that is in the opinion of his children. And there were other ways in which he was a wonderful father. For instance, he put my father through college, which, for all the talk of his fiscal irresponsibility, that was a very, very, very nice thing to do, and my father was always grateful to him for it. But there were other ways, I think, in which my father felt kind of emotionally neglected, and which I think influenced his style of behavior toward his children, which was also kind of reserved and unemotional and stuff. So from your perspective, because you were one of the people who was most intimately involved in grandfather and grandmother's decisions as parents with respect to Yvonne, how do you feel generally they did as parents, as opposed to brilliant architects and wonderful philosophers and architects of the fellowship?
Well, in certain respects, I think they did very well, because just being in their presence was a great thing for any child. But I don't think that they had a good philosophy of how to raise a child because, well, in the first place, when I was there, I was given the responsibility of trying to teach Yvonne, and of course I was no teacher. It was the blind leading the blind, you might say. We had a good time together, and I developed a nice relationship with Yvonne. We used to go for walks in the woods, and she tried to teach me to ride horseback and so forth and so on. But Mrs. Wright realized that she really had to go to school and kept trying to get Mr. Wright to let her go to school. But Mr. Wright was so possessive of her, he didn't really want to let her go, And so one time they were having a lunch in the little kitchen, in the little dining room, and I happened to be the server. And I went in, and they were having this terrible argument about sending her to school or not sending her to school. And Mrs. Wright said, "What do you think? Do you think it's necessary for a person to learn to read and write?" And I said, "Well, I don't think that any architect could function if he couldn't read and write." And that seemed to get Mr. Wright. And not only that, but the weight that Mrs. Wright brought, finally he decided that Yvonne should go to school. But you see, by that time, she was behind all the children her age, and it was a very difficult situation to get into school, besides which she was always led to suspect or to believe that she was much superior to everybody else, which made it very difficult for her to communicate with the children on their level. And that's gone on all her life, and I think that happened with Brandock too. I mean, it was a very bad thing to make them feel like a prince and princess in a democratic situation such as ours. But of course, Mrs. Wright had come from a background like that, and culturally, of course, they were ahead of all the other people. But the fact that the young people expected more from everybody than everybody was willing to give left them in a very bad situation for life.
Can you compare the way Svetlana was raised, although you weren't there, with the way Yvonne was raised? That is, well, let me hold that for a second, Cornelia. I actually want to ask another question. Was Yvonne a planned pregnancy?
I think she was, because Mrs. Wright told me once that she felt that she had had enough children or a child, and was not particularly interested, but Mr. Wright wanted a child. So I'm sure it was a planned pregnancy.
And what was the age difference between Spaten and Yvonne?
Well, it's very difficult for me to remember, but I say when Yvonne was about 7 or 8 years old, Svet was already about 20 or something like that. I mean, I can't remember the age difference, but it was a pretty big difference.
What was their relationship like? Can you describe it?
Well, when I first got there, Svetlana wasn't there because she and Wes had gone off, and Svet was living in Evanston and studying music. And I used to help Yvonne write letters to her, and at that time she was going by the name Sargon Wilde, which was her pen name. And it was not until a couple of years later that she and Wes married and came back to Taliesin. And she had had a totally different experience in life than Yvonne had, because she had grown up in the Gurdjieff Institute, where everyone was made to do a lot of work, and no one was made to feel superior to others. I mean, to the contrary, they weren't at all. So first of all, she'd grown up in that situation, and then for a while she lived with Aunt Sophie and Uncle Vlada, who probably, pampered him, but on the other hand, probably disciplined her too. And then she was in private school at one point, where she probably had to take her knocks with everybody else. So by the time she got to Taliesin, she was a very well-adjusted person working in a group, and had a lot of leadership and was very good at what she did. So her life was totally different than Yvonne's.
But did they have much of a relationship with each other, or Svet was so much older that...
Well, I think that there was a lot of jealousy between them, and Yvonne was never made to do the things she was supposed to do. And as one instance, I was supposed to be sent one time to pack Yvonne's things when she was already grown up. This was years later. And I had 2 children, had to pack for them and pack for a lot of other things. And when Svetlana heard about it, she said, absolutely not. I'll pack her things. So Svetlana threw all Yvonne's clothes into trunks, just not really packing them, but throwing them in, and thinking that she was really, doing the right thing. Well, by the time the trunks got down here, Yvonne simply sat back and said everything had to go to the cleaners and be pressed. So you couldn't win, She was allowed to get away with things. She was very much allowed to get away with whether she wanted to do something or not. For instance, when she took harp lessons from Mrs. Cooper in Madison, she would decide she was going to have a lesson. And at that time, we had no telephone at Taliesin. So she would go down to Spring Green and call Mrs. Cooper and say she was coming in for a lesson. A few minutes later, she'd decide she wasn't going for a lesson. So she'd go back down to Spring Green, call up and say she wasn't going for a lesson. And this could go on 3 or 4 times before there was any solution about whether she'd go or not go. And, probably she was very headstrong and very difficult to discipline, but on the other hand, most children would never have gotten away with the things that she got away with. And I think it was to her detriment, and I think that to this day she would have been happier had she had some of the disciplines that most of the people had.
Yeah, it's funny in a way. It's easier for me to understand why grandfather was kind of self-indulgent or indulgent toward Yvonne, but Olga Ivana was one of the great disciplinarians of the 20th century in many ways. She was an exquisite,
That's true, but the discipline didn't really always extend to her own children. The things that she demanded of me, for instance, and when I was taking care of 2 children, feeding into her with a bottle and so forth, and cooking at the same time, was something she never would have allowed where Eve was concerned. Eve had to be attended every minute of the time, you know. And so it didn't extend to her own children. That's all I can say.
Why do you think that was the case, Cornelia?
I don't know. I mean, I think that she was just so, you know, really absorbed in seeing that they had all the care they needed. And of course she had lost Svetlana, so she probably was doubly anxious about things.
Can you describe something about Olgavana's coping with Svetlana's death?
No, because I wasn't really there. I had just left 2 weeks before to go to Pittsburgh, just before her death, and of course I heard all about that, but I think somebody like Kay can tell you much more about that than I can.
Yeah. Cornelia, you've talked a lot about the kind of domestic and child-rearing responsibilities which you were given at Taliesin in addition to the rearing of your own children. Was it the case that women apprentices were gender-tracked, as they would now say, I think, into kind of nurturing domestic kinds of tasks, and that the male apprentices were not expected to do these things, although there were, obviously, everybody washed dishes and cooked, but can you talk about that?
I'll tell you, when I first came, Mr. Wright had the feeling that everybody should be totally equal, that all the girls should do exactly what the men did. And I tried my best, and I used to be sent out into the woods to help saw logs, and it would be snowing and cold, and we'd be out there sawing logs, and the huge logs that we're handling, you know, and I would get so exhausted. I would go behind a bush and cry to release my tension. Then I'd go back and haul more logs. Well, and then another thing that happened was sort of interesting is we were up in the dining room, the hill dining room, and there was some plumbing or something that was being fixed, and there was a big hole dug in the middle of the floor. It was a couple feet deep and very muddy. We went up for dinner, and I was dressed in high heels and just a nice dress for dinner. And Mr. Wright came in, and we were all standing around looking at this hole. And he said, "Get that plank in the bottom of the thing, bring it up here." And several of the boys started to do that. "No," he said, "I want Cornelia to do it." He insisted that I in my high heels get down in that mud and get that plank and bring it up. Well, more or less he got over that because Mrs. Wright really talked him out of doing it. But on the other hand, I spent a great deal of my time at Taliesin doing household things, you know, in the kitchen and taking care of rooms and doing the shopping and ordering. And I used to sew for Mrs. Wright for weeks on end, you know, remodeling her clothes and sewing things for her. So I spent a lot of my time at that sort of thing in the fellowship.
And looking back on it, do you feel that had some negative aspects as well as some positive aspects?
No, I don't really, because I never minded any task that I was given to do. I really wasn't. And I think that ultimately it doesn't matter that much. I also spent a lot of time later on, you know, decorating clients' homes and doing a lot of work in the palace and all these other things. And so I was never really inhibited by all that. It was just another part of life at the fellowship.
You were obviously one of the inner circle of people that Olgavana trusted, you know, without reserve. Can you describe how that relationship was created? Was it, on your side, was it immediate that the first time you met this woman, you just trusted her and were able to convey that to her? Or was this something that grew gradually? Or
well, I'll tell you a story that I really have never told publicly before. But when I first arrived at Taliesin, the way I arrived was a story in itself, but I arrived at the Porter house where they were having a party, and Mr. Wright came over to talk to me, and Mrs. Wright came over, and Mr. Wright said, "Oh, Yvonne, I'm talking to Cornelia," and she turned around and left. And from the very beginning, I was very impressed with Mrs. Wright and her intensity and all the fascination of her personality. But it turned out that Mrs. Wright was extremely jealous. And in one way, I think that's part of the reason I was kept in so many household tasks and sent to do things that were not in the studio. And I had a very difficult time because half the time I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't realize that she was that jealous of things I did, and she ascribed actions to me which I never intended at all. And I was rather naive, I think, not to understand more about it. But nonetheless, I got on as well as possible in the fellowship. And after Mr. Wright died, we were in the living room with everybody from Taliesin was gathered there. And Mrs. Wright said that she wanted to say that when I came as a young student, she was terribly jealous of me, and she didn't understand the possibilities that I had as Mr. Wright had understood, and she was apologizing for it, which I thought was a very big thing for her to do to everybody.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. I always had the feeling with grandmother that she could look through me, and that she had these, as you say, the kind of fascination about her, that just the way she looked at you, the way she spoke, just made you feel like it would be useless to try to conceal anything from her. But she was a very complicated person herself,
yes.
And both in her...
Well, I might also say that one reason that held me to the situation was that I felt that she tried to be objective in spite of her own feelings. And over all the years, she did marvelous things for me. And I can't say that she didn't. I mean, she really helped me in so many ways that it would be impossible to tell now just what all those ways were. And so, objectively, I felt that she was trying to be as above it all as she could be. But I think both she and Mr. Wright were very jealous by nature, as you've heard from other people, and you know yourself if you were in those situations. And they tried to conquer their jealousy, but sometimes it was very difficult.
Can you say something about their, let's say, grandfather's temper? Because I feel that runs kind of like a little vein through my whole family history of these kind of towering rages that come and go like thunderstorms and seem to have insufficient cause and then seem to just vanish and the sun is shining again.
Well, I never had actual experiences of that sort. Mr. Wright, I must say, was very partial to me, and I never really experienced personal rage from him. But of course I know from things that happened that he had those rages. I remember one time, there was practically no money at all. And in order to get to Madison was a major operation if you wanted to go to Madison to shop. And apparently one day Mrs. Wright had asked to go to Madison to shop. And all I know is that she came into the little kitchen wringing her hands and saying, "What a mean man, what a mean man," that because apparently she'd had some terrific explosion with him that he wasn't going to let her take the car to Madison. And I know they had all kinds of difficulties, but I was never a part of them.
Mm. I remember my mother coming upon them in some titanic fight, and old Ivana turning to her and saying, "You see how he treats me. You see what a beast he is." My mother, of course, wished heartily that she had never appeared there. But that's very interesting that you were such a favorite of his that he never showed that side.
Well, not only that, I mean, for instance, he liked my cooking. Mr. and Mrs. Wright both did, and I cooked for them a lot. And one time, I made a souffle for lunch, and it really wasn't any good. It fell, and I said, get something from the other kitchen because they have something better there. And he said, where'd this come from? They said, the other kitchen. He said, what's Cornelia making? They said, well, she made a souffle, but it fell. She said, it isn't good to serve. He said, I'll have it. If Cornelia made it, it's good, and I'll take it anyway. So that was the way it was, and he really did indulge me a lot. I want to tell you a story about learning to cook, though. Mrs. Wright really did teach all of us to cook, and she was excellent at that, a wonderful teacher. And there were certain things that she didn't approve of having, for instance, shrimp. She felt that we'd all be poisoned by shrimp. But one night I was cooking on a Saturday night, and I really wanted to make shrimp Creole. Well, Mrs. Wright finally said, well, all right, if you make shrimp Creole. She said, I won't eat it, but you can make it. So I made the shrimp Creole in a big iron pot and served it to everyone except Mr. and Mrs. Wright. And after dinner, everybody's tongue turned black. And I was terrified, and I called the doctor. And he said, well, you give everybody some castor oil. And so all it was is the iron of the pot had done this, with the tomato sauce. But we thought we were all poisoned. And Mabel Morgan went around ladling out tablespoons full of castor oil to everybody who had a black tongue.
Was this Dr. Wall?
That was Dr. Wall, famous Dr. Wall.
Yeah, I remember going to him with a cough, and we went into his office, and this was grandfather's favorite doctor, who was this country doctor who had very dubious credentials in many people's opinions, but he had cured. What was the story of why grandfather loved Dr. Wall so much?
Well, he pulled Mr. Wright through pneumonia. I mean, when the other doctor had given up, and the doctor from the hospital in Madison had, and Dr. Wall, with just his common sense, pulled Mr. Wright through, which was a terrific thing.
But Dr. Wall had some eccentricities. For instance, pepper. Wasn't it he who advised?
I don't know who advised Mr. Wright against pepper, but certainly pepper didn't appear on our table after this. I don't know who did that. But,
was that bout of pneumonia when Carl Sandburg was
yes,
visiting? Can you say something about that, Cornelia?
Well, Mrs. Wright was, extremely worried, not knowing whether she should send Mr. Wright to the hospital or not send him. And we were all young. She felt she couldn't rely on our opinion, and she was hoping for someone more mature. And Carl Sandburg appeared, and she had him in and talked to him and asked him what he thought. And he listened to the whole thing. Then he walked up and down the room rubbing his hands and said, well, an opinion has to be made. And therefore he walked out of the room. So he never helped her in any way. And he was a terrible egotist from my point of view. And he insisted on having his things read that he had recently written. So we were up in the dining room. And he said to me, you have a good voice. He said, read this, I've just written this thing. And it was a stupid thing, I felt. you know. I really can't remember. But it was something about the Gloogs do what they want to do, and they have bungholes in their heads, stick your fingers in, and things like that, you know. And everybody was very irritated by the thing, because here we were in a terrible situation, everybody worrying about Mr. Wright, and here he was reading his nonsense to us and wanting adulation, you know. So that was my opinion of Sandberg, and I know that Mr. Wright liked him a lot and talked about him quite a bit, but I know that Mrs. Wright never asked him back after that.
Do you feel that you said that they didn't really trust the young people by whom they were surrounded to, you know, advise them in this case? Do you feel that? I mean, here was a situation where grandfather was in his 60s, 70s, grandmother was in her 40s and 50s, and almost everybody else there in the 30s was in their 20s,
early 20s. Early 20s.
Do you think that there were times when they were lonely and felt...
Yes, I think there were times when they would have liked some more mature companionship, but in general, I think it was a great stimulus to them to have the fellowship, and people, you know, were very helpful and did wonderful things for them, too. And just as they did wonderful things for us. So it was a very good give and take.
What about the financial? You referred briefly to the financial problems of the 30s. Can you say a little bit more about life at Taliesin and how difficult it was without any steady income?
Well, it was very difficult, and I think especially for Mrs. Wright, because Mr. Wright would go away lecturing, and he got very little for those lectures. I mean, about $150 or something, probably hardly paid for his train fare, but meanwhile, Mrs. Wright would have to stay there and cope with and not have any money. And, well, of course, we'd go to Dodgeville, and Etta loaned us the groceries we needed, but just on general principles, we cultivated as much as we could in the garden, and we had our own chickens and our own milk and that sort of thing. But if we wanted to buy something like flour, we really didn't have money to do it. And at that time, if people came in to see Taliesin, which people would dribble in occasionally, it wasn't you know, an everyday occurrence, we would take them up on the hill garden and talk to them about the fellowship and charge them 50 cents. And then that 50 cents would be rushed down to Spring Green to buy something like flour or rice or something important. And it was just that tight, very touch and go. And when we were remaking rooms, Mr. Wright was reusing all kinds of old materials to do it. And we used whitewash, you know, to whitewash the walls, whitewash that had been made in the kiln, and other things too occasionally, but generally speaking, that was it.
What would happen when he would get a commission and some money would come in? How would you find out about, how would any change in the economic situation be communicated to the fellowship?
Immediately, I'd say. Everybody knew exactly if we were getting some big job and how much money was going to come in and what was going to happen, because Mr. Wright was very open about those things. He never concealed anything.
So how would he come in and announce that?
Well, he'd say, "Boys, we've just got this commission," and he'd talk about it. And of course, he always talked about architecture when we were at tea, as you probably know.
I want to ask you about kind of a delicate subject, Cornelia. Because it seems to me your experience is unique. You were this very attractive young woman, and there were many more men than women at Taliesin, and most of the women who stayed at Taliesin for any length of time ended up being married to several of the apprentices, sometimes to each other's husbands, and so it was kind of a pattern. Can you say something about your perspective on that, the business of the changing relationships among the
Well, I don't think that relationships changed among the fellowship members any more than it did in any other group of people anywhere else. But I think it was handled in a much better way, because Mrs. Wright was always very good at seeing that the whole thing was leveled out and worked out among the people, that they continued to be friends and be able to work together. So I think from that point of view, it was very unusual.
Yeah, I agree. The fact that so many former couples continue to work amicably as friends is very remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
I know that grandfather was outspokenly hostile to homosexuality, for instance, and I think grandmother's relationship was more complicated toward it. But can you say something about how there were always, because I think in any artistic endeavor or colony, there is probably a disproportionate number of people of whose emotions are attached to the same sex,
Mm-hmm.
probably more at Taliesin than there were in the population at large. And yet there was never any official either recognition of or tolerance of homosexuality in the fellowship that I know of. But how was this, again, from your perspective, how was this handled?
Well, I think that when I first came and there was a man that was a homosexual, and I used to talk with him, take walks with him and so forth, and that was all there was to it. But Mr. Wright was worried. He kept telling me he was a homosexual and that I should be careful in associating with him. I don't think that Mr. Wright understood homosexuality the way it's understood today. And I think that he learned to tolerate it because he began to realize what the situation was. It's very interesting to me, if you read some of the people who have delved into this, that they feel that the reason there's so many homosexuals among creative people is that everybody crosses over in life from male to female, from female to male. And in that general crossover, if a male has more female characteristics in crossing over, he becomes more creative. At least I think that's a very interesting explanation. I don't know whether it's true, but it's a very interesting idea. And it's certainly true that homosexuals are very creative, generally speaking.
Do you think that Olga Vanna helped grandfather come to a greater acceptance of homosexuality?
Well, I think she did, but I think she helped him in many ways, because when I first came, it had been during the Depression, and Mr. Wright had a very negative point of view of society in general, and was constantly complaining about it. And when he would complain, Mrs. Wright would gently tell him about some honor he'd received, some thing that people had said that was, wonderful commentator on his work in life. And she gradually changed him from a negative point of view to a more positive point of view. And I think that it was then that things began to happen for him.
Yeah, certainly he'd had a horrible 1920s.
Oh, awful. Yeah, it's just an awful time. And you could understand why he was negative about many things.
Did that negativity encompass political figures like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or did he have any political
Well, Mr. Wright
opinion?
liked Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Johnny was just saying the other night that he and Johnny's father had terrible fights about Roosevelt because Johnny's father just despised him. And Mr. Wright thought he was doing great things for the country. And one point they had such a violent argument that Johnny's father left. He was visiting Taliesin and he left. So I don't know, but Mr. Wright felt that he was saving capitalism for democracy. And so he really liked Roosevelt.
Indra also asked me to have you lay to rest the rumor that grandfather didn't like Abraham Lincoln. Can you comment on that?
Well, I can't really tell you much about it. I never really heard him talk too much about it, but he used to talk with, who was the man that wrote about Lincoln? You know, his friend who had a house in Libertyville.
Carl Sandburg wrote a lot about Lincoln.
Well, that too, but this is, can't think of his name.
Bedell.
What?
Bedell?
No.
No, it's Catherine and, well, I can't remember. But anyhow, he wrote a lot about Lincoln, and I'm sure they used to discuss it, but I never heard Mr. Wright speak against Lincoln.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you what my own parents' views were on Abraham Lincoln either. He's not a person that comes up often in conversation.
That's true. That's true.
But, well, this is very interesting, Cornelia. I really appreciate your
As
candor.
far as Roosevelt is concerned, when Maria first came to this country, you know, she was invited to come to the fellowship, and she'd just been here a couple weeks when the election came on for Roosevelt. And she was very excited about it. She used to talk to Hans Koch about it. Well, Hans Koch had been in this country for 18 or 20 years, but he had never become a citizen, so he couldn't vote. But Maria went out to the polls with us out in the Wyoming Valley, you know, in the little polling place out there. And Mr. Wright was there, and all of us trailed after him. And we got to the polling place, and they said, "Here come Wright's crew, give them their ballots." And they handed out ballots to all of us, and we all voted. And after we came away, Maria had asked us if she could come and watch and see what happened. Well, after we came away, she was very excited. She said, "They gave me a ballot, and I voted for Roosevelt, and I'm going to tell Hans to come and vote for Roosevelt." Well, of course, Hans knew better than that, but that was the excitement about Roosevelt at that time.
During when the Second World War broke out, it's well known that Wright objected to the war, to serving to the war, and therefore to military service in it, and there's a general feeling that he encouraged apprentices to take a pacifist position, and indeed 5 or 6 apprentices ended up in jail during the war. You had left, you were there until 1941?
Well, I was there, you know, just shortly before the war started. But, of course, Mr. Wright was very much against war. He felt it was an insanity. And he didn't have to tell people to be conscientious objectors. They felt themselves whether they wanted to be. But there were people that went off to war. For instance, Aaron Green felt obligated to go to war under the circumstances, and so did other people. So it wasn't only that just conscientious objectors came from Taliesin. There were many others that served in the war. And of course, Mr. Wright's views probably contributed to that, but at least each person decided for himself what he wanted to do.
One of the things I wanted to ask Dick yesterday, and we didn't have time, was Dick pointed out that when he came out of the Army into Taliesin shortly after the war, and he said there were a lot of veterans there. and that there were also all these returning pacifists who were coming from prison. Was there any tension that you remember between the people who had served in the Second World War and the people who had served as conscientious objectors?
I wasn't here just at that moment. I only visited then. I used to see them all as I visited, but to know what the tensions were, I wouldn't be able to say.
Yeah, okay.
Because I didn't come back until around 56, 57.
What brought you back in 56, 57?
Well, I had always wanted to be at Taliesin. I never wanted to be away from Taliesin. It was my life, I felt. And finally, I just decided to come back.
So it was more your husband, Peter's, decision to leave Taliesin than...
Yes. Well, my aunts had built this house that Mr. Wright helped me with, and they had land that some people purchased and wanted to make a development. We went there initially to do that development. But I always wanted to get back to Taliesin, and Peter didn't. He wanted to have a practice of his own. So, I mean, I was there 10 years or something before I got back. We used to come back and forth a lot, but to come and stay was quite a while before I got back.
So for you, coming back was just doing something you wished you'd never done. That is, it was rectifying a
Yes,
decision
right.
you wished never had been made. Did you find anything different when you returned in the 50s from the way it had been in the 30s, or?
Well, probably, there were differences, but I mean, having come back and forth all the time during that period, it didn't seem so to me. Necessarily. There was much more work, of course. I mean, Mr. Wright had so much work on the boards that it was a very busy place.
It's funny, his reputation from the time that you arrived to his death changed remarkably not so much within the fellowship, but in the world at large. I remember that when I was going to school, none of my classmates knew or cared who Frank Lloyd Wright was. When my father had gone to school, he had been an absolute embarrassment because of the social scandal of his divorce, and my father was kind of cringed at the mention of his name because of all his fellow students made fun of him. How did you perceive, was there any perception on your part that that things were changing in terms of the world's opinion, and that he was going from having been a pariah, really, in many ways when you first knew him, to being lionized in the late 50s? How did you perceive this change?
Well, I did notice it because when I was in architectural school, no one talked about Mr. Wright or probably even knew about him. I doubt if the Crits there really knew anything about him. And they all tried to discourage me from going to Taliesin. And then, quite a few years later, when Mr. Wright came to Pittsburgh to talk, he was already becoming more famous and people understood more about what he was doing. So then all these crits that had complained to me before tried to get to know Mr. Wright, and they were patting me on the back saying she was our student and here she's done this great thing, and that kind of thing. So that I realized personally, but the fame that Mr. Wright had, I think, grew out of all the marvelous work that he was doing all over the country, the fact that the fellowship expanded and people got to know more about him through the people that went out from the fellowship. He had much better press about things than he'd ever had before, and I think that Mrs. Wright was a tremendous influence in that, because she was always putting his best foot forward, talking wherever she could about the fellowship and Mr. Wright's work, and writing columns later on that kept it in the public eye. And I think she had a tremendous amount to do with spreading the knowledge.
We know quite a bit about the value of grandfather's teaching and doing for the members of the fellowship, but obviously the fellowship must have contributed ideas to him as well. Can you say something about that? For instance, the Hannah House, I think you were the person who came up with the hexagonal unit.
Well, yes, I think that Mr. Wright was so open to ideas that anyone that had any kind of an idea, he absorbed it and did something with it. Just as he absorbed the idea of using a hexagonal unit and made something spectacular out of it, which I certainly couldn't have done at that point. But he was very open to ideas, and people used to stand around his drawing board, as you know, and very often they might have suggestions that he would take, you know. I mean, he was... And I know that when we were practicing in the East, in this property of my aunt's, we decided to lay it out in circles and call it meadow circles. And shortly after that, we went to New York and we showed it to Mr. Wright. It was after that he laid out that place in New York in circles, you know. And so...
Which not the Guggenheim.
No. That settlement that they were working on there, you know, what was the name of the fellow that was doing that? The houses, there were a lot of houses in the thing.
Morton Delson? Was that
I don't know whether
project?
Morton was in on that or not. There was another man who was here who was doing it, and I'm not remembering anyone's names.
Was he, so that, is it fair to say that you were never intimidated, that, you know, he could be a very intimidating presence, but you never felt like if you offered an idea that he would, you know, say, how dare you, or anything that...
No, I don't think so. But I don't think he would have ever admitted that he got that idea.
Can you say something about the end of his life? It seems astonishing to most people that he could have been appearing to be just entering a new phase as he turned 90. And did you notice yourself any diminution in his powers, any increasing delegation of work to his to the senior apprentices in his last decade, or?
Well, there was so much work going on in the studio that a lot of people were pitching in, helping in a lot of different ways. I think Mr. Wright was still commanding all the real designs, the important ones, at that point. And it was a terrible shock to all of us when he died. I really never expected him to die. But at the time he died in the morning, I woke up suddenly, and I felt that angels were bearing up Mr. and Mrs. Wright. I can't explain it. It was a very unusual feeling. And then Jean called up and said Mr. Wright had just died.
Can you describe the first year after grandfather's death? That is, how were things kept going in that hard time?
Well, it was very difficult because none of the people here who were very advanced architecturally had ever taken a license, and everybody had to start getting licenses. And of course, Wes went all out and got one in every state in the Union, as he always did with things like that, and he had engineering licenses too. And so that was one of the things that people had to work on. And actually, I was the only one who had built houses or helped to build houses at that point. I didn't have a license because when we went to Pennsylvania, Mr. and Mrs. Wright said, it's better if only one person in the family has a license. You really shouldn't get a license. Peter should have the license. So he got a license when we went there, but I didn't. And I never did get a license until I got one in landscape architecture later on, after I returned here.
How did the fellowship cope with the loss of Wright in terms of the internal stresses? And
well, I think things more more or less went along very smoothly. I mean, Mrs. Wright seemed to manage, and she was a great captain of the ship and kept things moving and going. Of course, immediately after, she felt the necessity of having some tremendous program happen, and so we went to Wisconsin that spring and immediately started to redo all of Taliesin, repaint it and so on and so forth. And all these years, the people that have been dedicated and stayed here, and they put their life work into the buildings and the place and the fellowship and getting new students and seeing that things went on. Of course, there was this tough period when all buildings stopped every place, and it was really tough for all of us, too. But I think that the fellowship's coming out of that now, and we've got help from Wisconsin, and the government there is helping, and I think that people in Arizona are going to help. They've been more attuned to helping, actually, than people in Wisconsin. And I have no doubt that since the fame continues to spread, I think there's going to be worldwide support, people coming here and contributing and helping to keep the buildings as historic buildings. So I think that the thing, instead of diminishing, is really enlarging in a lot of ways. I don't think that it will ever be a museum. That was against Mr. Wright's principles to ever have something that was a dead space unlived in. And I think as long as we can maintain the fellowship, which is doing very well at the moment with new programs and people coming in from all over the world, they've never stopped coming here after Mr. and Mrs. Wright's death. And I don't see it as anything but a growing institution, both here and in Wisconsin. And I think that once Wisconsin is established as a winterized group of things will be even more lively than they are now.